The silence of house number 18. A true story. In the geography of human memory, some places are not defined by longitude or latitude, but by the events that scarred them. They become landmarks of tragedy, coordinates of loss. Before September 9th, 2004, the city of Toyoake, nestled in the heart of Aichi Prefecture, Japan, was a portrait of serene suburban life. It was a city of quiet streets, manicured gardens, and the gentle hum of normalcy. A place where families felt safe, where the greatest anxieties were morning traffic and a child's scraped knee. It was a place where monsters were confined to folklore and the flickering screens of late-night television. But on that day, a monster stepped out of the shadows and into a two-story home, a modest, respectable house at number 18 in a quiet, residential lane. And when it left, it took with it 4 lives and the city's innocence, leaving behind only silence, smoke, and a question that would echo through the decades. A question as cold and sharp as a killer's blade. This is the story of what happened in that house. It is a story of a family erased, of a phantom who vanished into the morning mist, and of a silence that screams louder than any cry for help ever could. Part 1. The Inferno and the Void. The first alarm sounded at 4:25 a.m. In the pre-dawn stillness of Toyoke, the piercing wail of fire sirens was a violent intrusion. It ripped through the thin veil of sleep, pulling residents from their beds to peer through curtains at the strobing red and blue lights painting the dark street. The lights were converging on a single point, the Kato residence. Smoke, thick and acrid, was billowing from the second-story windows of house number 18. It wasn't the clean, gray smoke of burning wood. It was a greasy, black plume, the kind that speaks of synthetic materials, of plastics, of fabrics, of a home being consumed from the inside out. Tongues of orange flame licked at the window frames, greedy and alive, threatening to devour the entire structure. Firefighters, their movements practiced and urgent, swarmed the property. Hoses snaked across the manicured lawn, and powerful jets of water began their assault on the blaze. To the neighbors huddled in their pajamas on the opposite side of the street, it was a terrifying spectacle. But for one man, who was just then pulling up in his car, it was the beginning of a living nightmare from which he would never wake. His name was Yoshihiro Kato. He was 45 years old, a hardworking man, a husband, and a father. He worked the night shift at a local factory, a sacrifice made to provide for the family he adored. His shift had ended, and he was driving home, perhaps thinking of the warm bed and the quiet house that awaited him. He was likely anticipating the familiar routine, tiptoeing in, maybe grabbing a cold drink from the fridge and settling down before the morning chaos of school preparations began. But instead of quiet, he found chaos. Instead of his home, he found an inferno. He slammed his car to a halt, his heart seizing in his chest. Panic, cold and electric, shot through him. He scrambled out of the vehicle, his mind refusing to process the scene. That was his house. That was his family's home. "Fumiko!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Rina, Koki, Takeru!" He tried to run towards the house, a primal instinct to save them driving him forward, but a firefighter's strong arm held him back. "Sir, you can't. It's not safe." The words were meaningless noise. Safety was inside that house. His world was inside that house. Fumiko, his vibrant, 38-year-old wife. Takeru, his eldest, a 15-year-old boy on the cusp of manhood. Koki, his quiet, gentle 9-year-old son. And Rina, his precious 7-year-old daughter, the baby of the family. They were in there. They had to be. He could only watch, helpless and broken, as the firefighters battled the blaze. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The black smoke pouring from the windows seemed to carry with it the ashes of his life. The sun began to rise, casting a sickly pale light on the scene, revealing the full extent of the damage. The flames were eventually subdued, leaving behind a steaming, blackened shell. The firefighters, clad in their heavy gear, moved inside. The neighbors watched in hushed silence. Yoshihiro stood frozen, a statue of pure dread. Then, a firefighter emerged, his face grim, his posture heavy. He spoke in low tones to a police officer who had arrived. The officer then approached Yoshihiro, his expression one of profound pity. The news was delivered not as a single blow, but as a series of methodical, soul-crushing strikes. They had found them, all four of them. But it wasn't the fire. The initial assumption, a tragic accident, a faulty wire, a forgotten cigarette, was violently shattered. As the smoke cleared and the initial chaos subsided, the first responders inside the house uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. The fire, they quickly realized, was not the cause of death. It was an afterthought, an attempt, as crude as it was monstrous, to cover up something far more sinister. The bodies of Fumiko Kato and her 3 children were not in their beds, overcome by smoke. They were scattered throughout the house, and each bore the marks of a brutal, frenzied attack. They had been stabbed, repeatedly, viciously. The house was no longer just a fire scene. It was a slaughterhouse. Part 2. The House of Vanished Dreams. To understand the depth of the horror, one must first understand the life that was extinguished. House number 18 was not just a structure of wood and plaster. It was a vessel of dreams, laughter, and the beautiful, mundane rhythm of family life. Fumiko Kato was the heart of that home. A dedicated homemaker, her days were a testament to her love for her family. Neighbors would see her tending to her small garden, her hands in the earth, coaxing flowers to bloom. They'd hear her calling her children in for dinner, her voice a familiar and comforting sound in the quiet evening air. She was active in the school's PTA, a friendly face at community events. Her world revolved around Yoshihiro and her children. Takaru, the eldest son at 15, was in that awkward, exciting phase between boyhood and adulthood. He was a student at the local high school, likely navigating the complexities of teenage life, friends, studies, and perhaps a budding interest in video games or music. To his younger siblings, he was the cool older brother, a figure to look up to and occasionally annoy. In him, Yoshihiro and Fumiko saw the future, a young man with his whole life stretching out before him. Koki, at 9, was the quieter one. Neighbors remembered him as a polite, slightly shy boy, often seen riding his bicycle around the neighborhood with a serious expression. He was at an age of discovery, where the world is a vast playground of new ideas and friendships. His room was likely filled with manga comics, action figures, and the treasures a 9-year-old boy collects. And then there was Rina, 7 years old, the light of the family, a first grader, full of giggles and boundless energy. Her drawings, vibrant and full of childlike wonder, probably adorned the refrigerator door. She was the family's joy, the little girl who could melt her father's heart with a single smile. Their life was a tapestry woven from ordinary threads: family dinners, homework at the kitchen table, arguments over the television, weekend outings. Yoshihiro's night shift schedule was a challenge, but it was a sacrifice they all understood. His return in the morning was part of their daily rhythm. The night of September 8th, 2004 had been like any other. The children had finished their homework. Dinner had been eaten. Stories might have been read. One by one, they had gone to their beds on the second floor, feeling the profound sense of security that only home can provide. Fumiko would have been the last one to turn off the lights, checking on each of her sleeping children, her heart full. The house settled into a deep, peaceful slumber, unaware of the shadow that was about to fall upon it. Part 3. The Intruder in the Dark. The official investigation would later piece together a timeline, but it is a skeleton of facts, devoid of the terror of the moment. To truly comprehend the crime, one must dare to imagine the unimaginable. One must walk, in spirit, with the phantom who entered that house. Sometime in the dead of night, likely between 3 and 4 a.m., he came. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no splintered door jams. This single fact opens a Pandora's box of chilling possibilities. Did he have a key? Did he find a door or window carelessly left unlocked? A simple, human oversight in a town that felt impossibly safe. Or, most terrifyingly, was he let in? He moved with a purpose that bespoke a chilling familiarity or a cold, calculated plan. He wore sneakers, Dunlop brand, size 27 centimeters, a US size 9, that would later leave bloody footprints, a ghostly map of his horrific journey through the house. He went upstairs first. This was not a simple burglary. A thief takes things. This intruder came to take lives. The geography of the second floor was simple: the parents' bedroom and the children's rooms. The evidence suggests a sequence of events so monstrous it strains belief. He did not go for the adults first. He went for the children. Imagine the absolute silence of the house, broken only by the soft breathing of sleeping children. The intruder enters a room. It could have been the boys' room first. Takaru, 15, and Koki, 9. Did they wake? Did they see the figure standing over them? A dark silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Was there a moment of confusion before the terror hit? Or did the attack come so swiftly, so brutally, that they were stolen from their dreams without a sound? The weapon was a knife. The attacks were not single, fatal thrusts. They were frenzied, a whirlwind of violence that left multiple stab wounds on their small bodies. It was an act of extreme, personal rage, or a cold, inhuman detachment. Then he moved to Rena's room, a 7-year-old girl, asleep in her bed, surrounded by dolls and innocence. The thought of what happened in that room is an abyss. To contemplate the final moments of a child so young at the hands of such a predator is to stare into the very heart of evil. It is at this point that the matriarch of the house, the she-wolf, was awakened. Fumiko Kato did not die passively. The evidence left on her body and at the scene tells a story of a mother's final, ferocious stand. Perhaps it was a sound, a muffled cry, a floorboard creaking under an unfamiliar weight that tore her from sleep. She got out of bed. She walked out of her bedroom and into the hallway, and there she met the monster. What she saw must have been a vision from hell. A strange man in her home, his clothes perhaps already stained, the glint of a blade in his hand. In that split second, instinct would have taken over. The primal, unthinking, all-powerful instinct of a mother protecting her young. The struggle was violent. The police would find signs of a desperate fight near the top of the staircase. Fumiko fought with the strength of a cornered animal. She clawed at her attacker, tearing at his skin, his clothes, trying to inflict any damage she could. It was in this desperate, heroic act that she sealed her attacker's fate, even as he sealed hers. Under her fingernails, forensic scientists would later find traces of his skin and blood, his DNA, a microscopic, indelible signature left by the Phantom himself. But she was unarmed, and he had a knife. He was driven by a black purpose she could not comprehend. She was stabbed repeatedly in the neck, the chest, the back. The final, fatal wounds were inflicted with such force that they were almost inhuman. She fell, her life bleeding out onto the floor of the home she had so lovingly created. Her last thoughts were surely of the children she had failed to save, not through any fault of her own, but because she had faced an evil that no amount of love could conquer. Her body was found at the foot of the stairs on the first floor, suggesting she may have been dragged or fell during the struggle. The killer was now alone in the silent, blood-soaked house. He was likely injured himself. Fumiko's defense had drawn blood. He was bleeding. His every step now left a damning trace. He walked from the second floor down to the first, his bloody Dunlop sneakers imprinting a path on the clean linoleum of the kitchen. He went to the kitchen sink. He tried to wash the blood from his hands, from his weapon. He was calm enough, cold enough, to attempt to clean up. But his own wound was bleeding, dripping his blood into the sink, mixing with the water and the blood of his victims. His work was not yet done. He was not just a murderer, he was an arsonist. He needed to erase his presence, to burn the evidence to ash. He gathered flammable materials, perhaps papers, clothes, and set a fire on the first floor, likely near a closet filled with futons. He knew it would catch quickly. Then, with the flames beginning to lick at the walls, he walked to the front door, stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, and vanished. He melted back into the fabric of society, leaving behind a house that was rapidly becoming a tomb and a funeral pyre. He took with him his rage, his motive, and his identity, becoming a ghost who haunted not just a house, but an entire nation. Part 4. The Hunt for a Phantom. When the sun was fully up on September 9th, House number 18 was a cordoned-off hub of grim activity. The Aichi Prefectural Police faced one of the most shocking and brutal crimes in their history. The lead investigators knew this was not the work of an amateur. The efficiency, the brutality, and the attempt to destroy the evidence pointed to a killer who was either incredibly bold or dangerously psychopathic. They began to assemble the pieces of the puzzle. The clues. 1. The footprints. The bloody sneaker prints were the most immediate clue. Size 27 centimeters, Dunlop brand model, max run. The police flooded the market, tracing the shoe. The problem was its ubiquity. It was an incredibly common, inexpensive sneaker sold at thousands of stores across Japan. Over 1.5 million pairs had been sold. It was like looking for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. 2. The DNA. This was their bombshell. The killer's blood and skin, captured by a dying mother's final act of defiance, was a direct link. They had his genetic fingerprint. In the modern age of forensics, this should have been the key to unlocking the case. They ran the DNA profile through Japan's National Criminal Database. Hopes were high. The result came back: no match. The killer had no prior criminal record of significance in Japan. He was a ghost in the system. 3. The entry. The lack of forced entry remained a deeply unsettling element. It narrowed the possibilities into two terrifying camps. The first was that the killer knew the family and was let in, or had access. Investigators painstakingly interviewed everyone who knew the Katos: friends, relatives, neighbors, Yoshihiro's colleagues, Fumiko's PTA acquaintances. They looked for anyone with a grudge, a secret, a dark side. They found nothing. The Katos were, by all accounts, a normal, well-liked family with no known enemies. The second possibility was a crime of opportunity, that the killer was a prowler who simply found an unlocked door. This theory turned Toyoke into a city of fear. Anyone's home could be next. The killer's injury. The killer was bleeding. He would have had a fresh wound, likely scratches on his hands, arms, or face. Police put out alerts to hospitals and clinics, asking them to report anyone seeking treatment for such injuries. No viable leads emerged. The killer either treated the wound himself or was able to explain it away convincingly. The theories. The investigation spun out in 1,000 directions. Was it a robbery gone wrong? This seemed unlikely. While Fumiko's wallet was missing, it contained only a small amount of cash. Other valuables in the house were left untouched. The sheer brutality of the violence was wildly disproportionate to a simple theft. A thief wants to get in and out quietly. This killer lingered to commit an atrocity. Was it a targeted attack fueled by a grudge? This was the most logical theory. Police scrutinized Yoshihiro Kato's life. Could there have been a dispute at work, a financial problem, a romantic rival? Yoshihiro was fully cooperative, his grief palpable and genuine. His alibi was ironclad. He was at his workplace, surrounded by colleagues. The police investigated him, as they must in such cases, and cleared him completely. They then looked at Fumiko. Could she have had a secret, an enemy no one knew about? Again, every path led to a dead end. She was, by all accounts, exactly who she appeared to be. Was it a thrill kill, a random act of pure evil? This was the most horrifying theory of all. The idea that a person could choose a house at random, for no reason other than a desire to inflict suffering and death, was a concept that shook the foundations of their orderly society. It meant the killer was not a person with a motive, but a force of nature, a human hurricane that could strike anywhere, anytime. The investigation became a massive undertaking. Over 200 officers were assigned to the case at its peak. They took more than 50,000 DNA samples from men in the area, a vast and desperate sweep, hoping for a random match. They interviewed thousands. They chased down tens of thousands of tips about the Dunlop sneakers. But every lead evaporated. Every promising trail went cold. The Phantom had been meticulous, or incredibly lucky. The DNA was a perfect profile of a man who didn't seem to exist. The shoes were a needle in a nationwide haystack. The motive was a complete void. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The large-scale investigation was eventually downsized. The posters with sketches of the Dunlop sneaker and appeals for information began to fade on public bulletin boards. But for the police, and for Yoshihiro Kato, the case never closed. Part 5. The Echoes in the Silence. A house where a family is murdered can never be a home again. It becomes a monument. House number 18 stood empty for years, a dark, silent sentinel on a street that had tried to return to normal. The windows were boarded up. The garden Fumiko had so lovingly tended grew wild and untamed. It was a physical manifestation of the unresolved horror, a constant, painful reminder for the entire community. Eventually, to give the neighborhood and the grieving father some peace, the house was torn down. An empty lot remains, a scar on the landscape where a family once lived. For Yoshihiro Kato, life became a purgatory. He lost everything in a single morning. How does a man continue after his entire world has been violently erased? He became the sole keeper of his family's memory, a lonely crusader for a justice that never came. Year after year, on the anniversary of the murders, he would stand before the media, his face etched with a grief that time could not soften, and plead for information. His life became defined by two events: the beautiful life he had with his family, and the horrific moment it was stolen. The Toyoki murders left an indelible mark on the Japanese psyche. In a country with a remarkably low crime rate, such a brutal and seemingly random act of violence was deeply shocking. It introduced a new kind of fear, the fear of the unlocked door, of the stranger walking down the street, of the enemy with no name and no face. The statute of limitations for murder in Japan was 25 years. As the years ticked by, there was a growing fear that the phantom of Toyoki would simply wait out the clock and get away with it forever. But in 2010, in part due to high-profile unsolved cases like this one, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for murder. The hunt for the killer of the Kato family is officially eternal. Today, the case remains open, but it has gone cold. The file sits on a shelf in the Aichi Prefectural Police Headquarters, thick with reports, dead-end leads, and the DNA profile of a ghost. The police still hold out hope that one day, technology will advance, or someone's conscience will break. Perhaps the killer, now decades older, will make a mistake. Perhaps a relative or friend who has held a dark secret for years will finally come forward. But for now, there is only silence. It is the silence of a house that no longer stands. The silence of 3 children who never got to grow up. The silence of a mother who died fighting for them. It is the silence of a husband and father left to wander in the wilderness of his grief. And somewhere, perhaps living a quiet, ordinary life, is a man with old scratches on his hands and the DNA of his victims encoded in his very being. He walks among us. He might be a neighbor, a co-worker, a stranger in a crowd. He is the phantom of Toyoaki, a man who committed one of Japan's most horrific crimes and simply walked away. He carries his own silence, the silence of the unconfessed, the silence of pure, unpunished evil. And it is that silence, the silence of a question that has never been answered, that is the most terrifying ghost of all. The Phantom of Meito Ward. A true story of terror in suburban Japan. The air in Meito Ward, Nagoya, on the evening of September 8, 1999, was thick with the scent of late summer, a humid, heavy blanket carrying the aroma of damp earth and the distant metallic tang of the city. It was the kind of evening that promised nothing more than the gentle turning of a page from one day to the next. In the tranquil grid of 2-story homes, where meticulously pruned bonsai stood sentinel in tiny gardens, and the silence was broken only by the hum of air conditioners and the chirping of crickets. The Yamada family was settling into their nightly rhythm. Their home was an emblem of the Japanese dream, a modest but immaculate house, its cream-colored siding glowing under the soft porch light. Inside, the world was a sanctuary of order and affection. Mr. Yamada, a dedicated salaryman, was away on a business trip, a common occurrence that left his wife, Mika, in charge of their small, vibrant kingdom. At 32, Mika was the sun around which her 2 small planets orbited. 6-year-old Madoka, a bright-eyed girl with a penchant for drawing, and 2-year-old Yusuke, a whirlwind of toddler energy, his laughter the home's primary soundtrack. That evening, the routine was a comfort. Madoka sat at the low kotatsu table, her crayons scattered as she finished a drawing for her father, a colorful depiction of their family under a giant, smiling sun. Yusuke, fresh from his bath, toddled around in his pajamas, occasionally crashing into his mother's legs for a hug. Mika moved through the house with a practiced grace, clearing the dinner dishes, her thoughts a gentle hum of tomorrow's errands and the anticipation of her husband's return. The television murmured in the background, a lo-fi anchor to the outside world, a world that felt a million miles away. Outside, in the encroaching darkness, another world was preparing to collide with theirs. This world belonged to Yasuaki Uwabe. At 35, Uwabe was a ghost haunting his own life. He was a man hollowed out by perceived slights and monumental grievances. Fired from his job as a truck driver for a parcel delivery service months earlier, he had been stewing in a toxic brew of resentment and paranoia. He saw conspiracies in every corner, insults in every glance. Society, he believed, had cast him out, branded him a failure, and left him to rot. He had compiled a list, a meticulously typed litany of his enemies, his tormentors, the companies and individuals who he felt had wronged him. But a list wasn't enough. A list was silent. He craved a voice, a stage, an act so loud it would shatter the indifference of the world that had ignored him. He hadn't chosen the Yamada family, not specifically. In the terrifying calculus of his fractured mind, they were simply a symbol. They were everything he wasn't. Happy, stable, part of the fabric of the society that had rejected him. Their house was just a house on a street he had driven down. Its lights were on. Someone was home. That was enough. He parked his car a few blocks away, the tools of his rage tucked into a bag, a heavy framing hammer, a long, sharp kitchen knife, several containers of gasoline, and a roll of duct tape. He walked through the quiet suburban streets, not as a man, but as a predator. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bark of a dog was part of his soundtrack. He was the phantom of Maida Ward, and he had come to collect a debt that the Yamadas never knew they owed. He approached the house from the side, staying in the deep shadows cast by a neighboring wall. He peered through a window into the living room. He saw the scene of domestic bliss, the mother, the little girl, the toddler. A portrait of warmth, a wave of something cold and powerful, not hatred, but a chilling sense of purpose, washed over him. This was the stage. This was where he would make his stand. Mika was wiping down the kitchen counter when she heard the first sound, a sharp, grating scrape against the side of the house. She paused, her hand hovering over the sink. A cat? A branch scraping in the wind? She dismissed it. The house was full of its own groans and sighs. But then came a second sound, louder this time, a thud against the glass of the sliding door that led to the small garden. "Madoka-chan," she called out, her voice calm but laced with a sudden, prickling curiosity. "Did you leave a ball outside?" "No, Mama," the little girl replied without looking up from her drawing. Mika felt the first whisper of unease. It was a faint, cold tendril that snaked up her spine. The neighborhood was preternaturally safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked during the day. But this was night, and she was alone with the children. She walked to the sliding door, her slippers shuffling softly on the tatami mat. She pulled back the lace curtain just an inch. At first, she saw nothing but the reflection of her own worried face in the dark glass. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the garden. A man. He was standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the porch light, his face a pale, featureless oval in the gloom. Her breath caught in her throat. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through her. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a lost delivery man. The way he stood, the predatory stillness, was wrong. Utterly, terrifyingly wrong. Her mind screamed, "Lock the door!" But before she could even move, the man lunged forward. There was a horrific, explosive sound, the sound of shattering glass. It wasn't a polite knock or a fumbled attempt to open the latch. It was an act of pure violence. The man's arm, wrapped in a dark jacket, smashed through the pane, sending a shower of glittering shards across the floor. An instant later, his hand was inside, fumbling for the lock. Mika screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the sudden chaos. She stumbled back, grabbing for her children. "Madoka! Yusuke! Come to Mama!" The lock clicked open. The door slid aside with a screech of tortured metal, and the phantom stepped inside. Yasuaki Uwabe filled the doorway, a silhouette against the night. He was not a physically imposing man, but in that moment, he was a giant, a monster ripped from a nightmare. In one hand, he held the hammer, its clawed head gleaming. In the other, the long, wicked-looking knife. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, scanned the room, settling on Mika as she tried to shield her terrified children behind her. "Don't scream," he said. His voice was unnervingly flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who had already made his decisions, who was merely executing a plan. "Do exactly as I say, and you won't get hurt." It was the oldest lie a monster ever told. The next few minutes were a blur of cold terror for Mika. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The man, this invader in her sanctuary, moved with a terrifying efficiency. He ordered her to a chair, his voice a low, insistent hiss. Madoka was sobbing, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Little Yusuke, too young to understand, but old enough to sense the suffocating fear in the room, began to wail, his cries piercing the tense silence. "Shut that kid up," Uwabe snapped, gesturing with the knife. The blade caught the light, a sliver of deadly promise. Mika, her own fear a roaring inferno in her chest, forced herself to act. She scooped Yusuke into her lap, rocking him, murmuring nonsense words of comfort, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to be calm. For her children, she had to be calm. She looked at Madoka, whose face was pale and streaked with tears. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, a lie that felt like ash in her mouth. "It's going to be okay." Uwabe seemed to feed on their fear. He pulled out the roll of duct tape. He bound Mika's wrists and ankles to the chair, the tape pulling cruelly at her skin. He then turned to Madoka. The little girl flinched as he approached, a small, wounded animal. He taped her hands behind her back. He didn't bind Yusuke, leaving the toddler to cling to his mother's legs, his sobs quieting to whimpers. The house, once a haven, was now a cage. The air was thick with the smell of the intruder's sweat and the metallic tang of Mika's own fear. The broken glass on the floor glittered like scattered diamonds in a scene of utter devastation. "What do you want?" Mika asked, her voice shaking but clear. "Money? We don't have much, but you can take whatever you want. Please, just don't hurt my children." Uwabe let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a horrible, grating sound. "Money? You think this is about money?" He paced the small living room, his boots crunching on the glass. "This is about justice. This is about being heard." He stopped in front of her, his face inches from hers. She could see the faint stubble on his cheeks, the wild, unfocused look in his eyes. He smelled of stale cigarettes and something else, something sour, the smell of decay. "I'm going to call the police," he announced, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "I have things to say. They're going to listen to me tonight. And you," he jabbed a finger at her, "you and your children are my insurance." He found the phone and dialed 110, the emergency number. Mika listened in horrified disbelief as he spoke. His voice, once flat, was now animated, filled with the venom of 1,000 grievances. He announced that he was Yasuaki Uwabe. He said he had hostages, a woman and her 2 children, at an address in Mato Ward. He demanded to speak to the highest-ranking officers. He began to rant, a torrent of words pouring out of him about his former employer, about conspiracies, about the injustices of the world. For Mika, trapped and helpless, the world shrank to the confines of that room. The rhythmic pacing of her captor, the glint of his weapons, the terrified eyes of her daughter, the weight of her son against her legs. This was her reality now, a waking nightmare orchestrated by a madman. Outside, the first police car, its sirens silent but its lights flashing, turned onto the Yamada's street, cutting through the placid darkness of the neighborhood. The siege had begun. The response from the Aichi prefectural police was swift and massive. The initial report, a man with weapons holding a mother and two small children hostage, was the stuff of every officer's worst fears. Within the hour, the quiet suburban street was transformed into a tense, sprawling command zone. Uniformed officers established a perimeter, their yellow tape a stark, clinical boundary between the normal world and the House of Horrors. News vans began to arrive, their satellite dishes sprouting like metallic mushrooms, their crews kept at a respectful but hungry distance. Inside the mobile command post, a cramped vehicle buzzing with the low hum of electronics and hushed, urgent voices, Superintendent Kazuki Tanaka tried to piece together a picture of the man they were dealing with, Yasuaki Uwabe. A quick background check revealed the firing, the subsequent reclusiveness, the signs of a man spiraling into oblivion. He was a ghost who had suddenly decided to become a monster. The police force's elite special investigation team, SIT, clad in black tactical gear, assembled in the shadows, their faces grim. They were the last resort, the physical solution to a problem that everyone hoped could be solved with words. The primary responsibility for that fell to the negotiators. They established a phone link to the house, their voices calm and measured, a stark contrast to the frantic, paranoid energy radiating from Uwabe on the other end of the line. "Uwabe-san, this is the police. We are here to listen. Tell us what you need." Mika, bound to the chair, could hear only one side of the conversation, Uwabe's. It was a rambling, incoherent diatribe. He shouted about his former boss. He claimed the delivery company had framed him, sabotaged his truck, and ruined his life. He demanded apologies. He demanded that the media broadcast his story. His demands were a chaotic jumble of the impossible and the insane. Hours bled into hours. The initial adrenaline of the intrusion gave way to a grueling, soul-crushing marathon of terror. The house grew hot and stuffy. The smell of fear was now mingled with the sour odor of unwashed bodies and stale air. Yusuke had cried himself to sleep in a small, exhausted heap at Mika's feet. Madoka sat silently, her eyes wide and vacant, her face a mask of trauma. She had retreated deep inside herself, to a place where the monster couldn't reach her. For Mika, the passage of time was marked by the shifting moods of her captor. Uwabe was a pendulum of volatility. At times, he would sit, the hammer resting in his lap, and stare into space, lost in his own dark world. In these moments, Mika would dare to hope. Maybe he would tire. Maybe he would give up. Then, without warning, the rage would return. He would leap to his feet, pacing and ranting, waving the knife, his voice rising to a fever pitch. During one of his calmer moments, he looked at Mika, a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. "They think I'm nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "They all looked down on me. The other drivers, the managers, they laughed." He looked around the cozy living room, at the family photos on the shelf, Mika and her husband on their wedding day, Madoka's first day of school. "You have all this," he said, a note of pathetic envy in his voice. "You don't know what it's like to have nothing." Mika saw a sliver of an opening. "Please," she said, her voice soft. "My children, they're just babies. They've done nothing to you. Let them go. You can keep me. Just let my children go." For a heart-stopping second, he seemed to consider it. His face softened, but then the mask of rage snapped back into place. "No, they're part of it. They're my audience. The whole world is my audience tonight." The phone would ring, and the cycle would begin again. The calm, professional voice of the negotiator on one end, the furious broken man on the other. The police tried every tactic. They offered him food and water. They promised him a platform to tell his story if he would just come out peacefully. They brought his mother to the scene, hoping her voice might break through his psychosis. "Yasuaki," her voice crackled over a police megaphone, a desperate, pleading cry from an elderly woman. "Please, son, stop this, come out." Uwabe heard it. He froze, his head cocked to one side. He went to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. He saw the flashing lights, the lines of police, the controlled chaos. He saw the world arrayed against him. His mother's plea didn't soothe him, it enraged him. It was just another trick, another part of the conspiracy. "They're using her against me," he shrieked, turning from the window, his eyes wild. "They'll do anything." The night wore on, a thick, suffocating blanket of dread. The standoff had now lasted over 10 hours. The SIT commandos grew restless. Negotiation was failing. The man inside was too far gone, his psyche a shattered mirror. The risk to the hostages was increasing with every passing minute. A whispered debate began in the command post. How much longer can we wait? When do we go in? Inside the house, a fatal shift was occurring in Uwabe's mind. The initial adrenaline rush of power had faded, replaced by a gnawing paranoia and the crushing weight of his situation. He was trapped. There was no way out that ended with him a free man. The apologies he demanded would never come. The justice he craved was a fantasy. The world wasn't listening. It was waiting for him to fail, to be captured, to become just another sad headline. He would not give them the satisfaction. If he couldn't have his victory, he would have his inferno. He would write the final act himself, in fire and ashes. Mika saw the change in his eyes. The manic energy was replaced by something colder, more resolute, a terrifying finality. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with the containers he had brought with him. Gasoline. The sharp chemical stench filled the room, instantly overpowering every other smell. It was the smell of impending death. No, Mika breathed, the word catching in her throat. The last vestiges of hope disintegrated. This was it, the end. Please, God, no. Uwabe ignored her. He moved through the house with a new, grim purpose, sloshing the flammable liquid onto the tatami mats, the sofa, the curtains. The fumes were dizzying, making the air thick and hard to breathe. He splashed it near the chair where Mika was bound. He splashed it around the sleeping form of her son. Madoka, jolted from her catatonic state by the horrifying new threat, began to scream again. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror. Please, Mika begged, twisting against her bonds, the duct tape cutting into her wrists. Not the children. Please, I'm begging you. Kill me, but let them live. Uwabe looked at her, his face a blank mask. There was no rage left, only a chilling emptiness. It's too late, he said, his voice as flat as a gravestone. The show is over. He pulled a cheap plastic lighter from his pocket. From outside, the police negotiators sensed the shift. The line had gone quiet. Something was wrong. The SIT leader gave a tense, clipped order, prepare for entry. On my mark. But they were too late. Inside the house, Mika Yamada watched in slow-motion horror as Yasuaki Uwabe flicked the lighter. A tiny spark. A small, hungry flame. He let it drop. The world erupted. The gasoline fumes ignited with a deafening whoosh that blew the windows out of their frames. A fireball roared through the living room, instantly consuming everything in its path. The heat was unimaginable, a physical blow that seared the skin and stole the air from the lungs. The last thing Mika saw was a wall of orange and black fire roaring towards her and her children. Her final act on this earth was a desperate, futile lurch of her body, an instinct to shield them from the hell that had been unleashed. Outside, the explosion rocked the street. Flames shot 30 feet into the night sky, turning the house into a raging funeral pyre. The order to breach was no longer a strategic decision. It was a desperate, hopeless rescue mission. Go, go, go. The SIT team charged, using a battering ram to smash through the front door, which was already engulfed in flames. They were met by a wall of black smoke and blistering heat. Visibility was zero. The air was a toxic soup of burning plastic, wood, and insulation. Through the chaos, they heard a man screaming, not in pain, but in triumph. Uwabe had set himself on fire as well, but in his madness, he had stumbled or been blown towards the back of the house, away from the main blaze. He burst out of the burning kitchen, his clothes smoldering, and ran into the arms of the waiting police. He was still shrieking, a madman's victory cry, even as they tackled him to the ground and extinguished the flames on his body. While some officers subdued Uwabe, a team of firefighters and SIT officers plunged into the inferno. Among them was Sergeant Takatomi Sano, a 29-year-old officer with a young family of his own. He charged into the smoke-filled corridor without hesitation, driven by the thought of the children trapped inside. The heat was overwhelming. the structure groaning as it began to collapse. Sano and his partner fought their way towards the living room, the source of the blaze. They found the bodies. Mika and her 2 children were huddled together, consumed by the fire that their captor had set. There was nothing anyone could do. As they retreated from the impossible heat, a section of the ceiling, weakened by the flames, collapsed. A heavy, burning beam struck Sergeant Sano, trapping him. His comrades struggled frantically to free him, but the fire was too intense. They were forced back by the roaring flames. By the time the fire was extinguished hours later, the sun was beginning to rise on a scene of utter devastation. The immaculate house in Mado Ward was now a blackened, skeletal ruin, a gaping wound in the heart of the quiet neighborhood. Steam and smoke still rose from the smoldering ashes. 3 bodies were recovered from the living room: Mika Yamada, 32, her daughter Madoka, 6, and her son Yusuke, 2. They were found clustered together, a final, tragic tableau of a mother's love. A 4th victim was pulled from the wreckage later that morning: Police Sergeant Takatomi Sano. He had died of smoke inhalation after being trapped while trying to save a family that was already gone. Yasuaki Uwabe survived. He was treated for his burns and arrested, his mad, triumphant shrieks from the night before replaced by a sullen silence. His grand performance was over. He had finally gotten the world's attention. The price was 4 innocent lives, a family annihilated, and a hero lost. In the aftermath, Japan was left to grapple with the horror. The crime wasn't just a murder, it was an attack on the very idea of sanctuary. Uwabe was the phantom who could appear at any window, the faceless grievance that could shatter any family. He was a product of a society he felt had abandoned him, and in his final horrific act, he had sought to burn that society down, starting with one small, happy home in Nagoya. Uwabe was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. He sits on death row to this day, a ghost once more, waiting for the final knock on his own door. But for the residents of Mado Ward, and for a nation that watched in horror, the story doesn't end with a verdict. It ends with the lingering image of a blackened patch of land where a home once stood, a silent testament to a night when the ordinary rhythm of life was shattered by the footsteps of a phantom, and a suburban sanctuary became a tomb. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those that hide in the shadows, but those who walk among us, their silent rage waiting for a single spark to set the world on fire. The silence in the house of Yamada. The town of Kani, nestled in the coastal plains of Aichi Prefecture, is the kind of place that prides itself on its quietude. It is a commuter town, a peaceful suburb of the bustling industrial giant of Nagoya. Life there unfolds in predictable, comforting rhythms. The morning rush to the train station, the lazy afternoon hum of cicadas in summer, the soft glow of television screens in living rooms as evening settles. In Kani, houses are homes, not fortresses. Doors are locked out of habit, not fear. Neighbors exchange pleasantries over manicured hedges, their conversations revolving around weather, gardening, and the academic progress of their children. It was a town woven from the threads of normalcy, a place where the darkness of the world felt distant, something seen only on the news. In a modest 2-story home on a street indistinguishable from 100 others, the Yamada family lived out their own version of this Japanese dream. The house was a repository of memories, its walls saturated with the scent of Misako Yamada's cooking and the echoes of laughter. At 57, Misako was the anchor of the family. Her hands, though beginning to show the fine cartography of age, were rarely still. They were either tending to her small garden, folding laundry with practiced precision, or preparing meals that were the talk of her small social circle. She was a woman of gentle routines, her life a testament to the quiet dignity of a devoted mother and wife. Her 2 children, now adults, were her greatest pride. Chika, 26, was bright and ambitious, a young woman with a kind smile and a promising career at an insurance firm. She possessed her mother's warmth, but channeled it into the modern world, navigating her professional life with a quiet confidence. Her younger brother, Takayuki, 25, was more reserved, a steady presence, who worked a respectable job and still lived at home, contributing to the household and enjoying the comfort of his mother's care. Their father, often away on business, had entrusted the heart of the home to Misako, and she had nurtured it into a sanctuary. The first day of May in 2009 dawned like any other. A soft spring light filtered through the windows of the Yamada home. Misako was likely already awake, moving through the familiar spaces of her kitchen, the soft clink of ceramic on wood, the only sound in the early morning air. The world outside was stirring, but inside this house, a fragile bubble of peace was about to be irrevocably shattered. Unseen, unknown, a shadow was falling over Kani. This shadow had a name, but for now, it was just a presence, a knot of desperation tightening in the gut of a man named Lin Jun. He was 29, a Chinese national in Japan on a technical trainee visa. He was supposed to be learning a trade, building a future. Instead, he was drowning. The promise of Japan had soured, replaced by the crushing reality of low wages and mounting debt. Loan sharks, with their honeyed promises and steel-trap threats, had sunk their teeth into him. Every yen he earned was swallowed by interest, and the hole he was in only grew deeper. Desperation is a powerful acid. It corrodes morality, dissolves reason, and eats away at the barrier between civilized thought and primal action. For Lin Jun, that barrier had become perilously thin. He had begun to watch the houses in the quiet suburbs, not with the eye of an admirer, but with the cold calculus of a predator. He saw not homes, but containers. Containers of money, of jewelry, of anything that could be turned into cash to appease the circling sharks. His gaze eventually settled on the Yamada residence. It was unremarkable, which made it perfect. It didn't scream of wealth, but it spoke of stability, of a life where money was a utility, not a constant, gnawing source of terror. He watched it for days, learning the rhythms of the family. He saw the mother tending her garden. He saw the son and daughter leave for work each morning and return each evening. He saw the father was rarely there. He saw an opportunity. On the night of April 30th, the final vestiges of his conscience dissolved. He armed himself not with a gun, but with the brutal, impersonal tools of a desperate man, a heavy-duty wrench and a knife. He was no professional killer. He was something far more terrifying, an ordinary man pushed to an extraordinary extreme, his humanity stripped away by financial panic. The house was dark. The Yamada family was asleep, lost in dreams of work deadlines, weekend plans, and the simple comforts of home. Lin Jun slipped through the night like a phantom. He found an unlocked first-floor window, a testament to the town's misplaced sense of security. The slight creak of the window frame as he slid it open was a sound that should have shattered the night, a clarion call of violation. But no one heard it. He hoisted himself over the sill, his feet landing on the polished floor with a soft thud that was absorbed by the silence of the house. He was inside. The air, thick with the scent of sleeping lives and lingering dinner spices, felt alien in his lungs. For a moment, he stood frozen in the darkness, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every creak of the old house was a potential discovery, every shadow a witness. He moved with a thief's caution, his eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom, a black-clad ghost in a stranger's sanctuary. His goal was simple: find money, find valuables, and disappear back into the night. But the silence of a sleeping house is a fragile thing. Upstairs, Misako Yamada stirred. Perhaps it was a faint sound from below that pricked her subconscious, a floorboard groaning under an unfamiliar weight. Or maybe it was just a mother's intuition, a primal sense that something was fundamentally wrong in her domain. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the floor. She wasn't afraid, not yet. It was probably just the house settling, or one of the children getting a late-night glass of water. She descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the familiar smooth wood of the banister. The downstairs living area was cast in the deep, inky shadows of pre-dawn. As her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A shape, a silhouette, a man who did not belong. He was standing near the family altar, his form a black hole in the fabric of her home. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. For Misako, it was a moment of pure, paralyzing disbelief. Her mind scrambled to make sense of the impossible. A burglar, Here, in Caney, in her home. A question formed on her lips, a soft, confused sound. For Lin Jun, that sound was a death knell. Panic, cold and electric, surged through him. He was seen. The plan was ruined. The quiet, surgical robbery he had envisioned had just become messy and loud. There was no thought, only a feral instinct to erase the witness, to silence the sound that would bring his world crashing down. He lunged. Misako had no time to scream. The first blow from the wrench was a sickening, crushing impact that sent a starburst of agony through her skull. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pain and confusion. She fell, the sound of her own body hitting the floor, a distant, disconnected thing. He was on her then, a whirlwind of desperate, brutal violence. The wrench rose and fell, a grim piston of death, silencing not just her voice, but her very existence. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, a profane perfume that would forever stain the memory of the house. And then, silence. A new kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but the dead, heavy silence of the grave. Lin Jun stood over the body of Misako Yamada, his chest heaving, the wrench slick and heavy in his hand. The adrenaline coursed through him, a toxic cocktail of terror and triumph. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer a thief, he was a murderer. But the panic, having served its purpose, began to recede, replaced by a chilling, predatory calm. His original problem remained. He needed money. Leaving now, empty-handed, would make this horrific act utterly pointless. He was already damned, so he might as well get his reward. And then a new, colder thought slithered into his mind. The daughter. The son. They would be coming home. If he left now, the body would be discovered within hours. The police would be called. An all-points bulletin would be issued. His face, captured on some train station security camera, would be plastered across every screen in the country. He would be caught. But if he stayed, if he waited, he could eliminate the other witnesses. He could buy himself time, hours, maybe even a full day before anyone realized something was wrong. It was a decision of monstrous and inhuman logic. He had turned the Yamada home into a slaughterhouse, and now he would turn it into his lair. He was no longer just an intruder. He was an occupying force. The hours that followed were a descent into a unique circle of hell. The sun began to rise, casting gentle morning light through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and the horrific, still tableau in the living room. Lin Jun, with a terrifying presence of mind, dragged Misako's body to a less conspicuous spot, concealing it from casual view from the windows. Then, he began to live in their home. This was the true horror, the ultimate violation. He was a ghoul, feasting on the life of the family he was destroying. He went to the kitchen, his blood-stained hands opening their refrigerator. He saw the neat containers of leftovers, the food Misako had prepared with love for her children. He took out a carton of milk and drank from it. He found snacks and ate them, the mundane act of chewing and swallowing, a grotesque counterpoint to the murder he had just committed. He explored their home, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. He touched their photographs, his gaze falling on the smiling faces of the family. He saw Chika, radiant and happy. He saw Takayuki, strong and youthful. He saw Misako, the woman whose life he had just extinguished, beaming with pride. There was no flicker of remorse, only the cold assessment of a predator studying its prey. Time crawled by. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with agonizing slowness, each tick a countdown to the next act of violence. He could hear the sounds of the neighborhood outside, a dog barking, a car starting, children laughing on their way to school. It was a normal world, functioning just meters away, completely oblivious to the abomination lurking within the walls of the Yamada house. He was an invisible monster, hiding in plain sight. He used their bathroom. He sat on their sofa. For nearly 12 hours, he made their sanctuary his own, waiting. The house became a pressure cooker of suspense, the air thick with the unspoken, the unseen, the waiting. As evening approached, the tension in the house reached an almost unbearable pitch. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. For anyone else in Caney, it was the beautiful end to a spring day. For Lin Jun, It was a signal. The children would be coming home. At around 7 p.m., the sound he had been waiting for came, the jingle of keys at the front door. Chika Yamada was tired. It had been a long day at the office. As she walked from the station, she was likely thinking of a hot bath, of her mother's dinner, of sharing a laugh with her brother. She was stepping back into her haven, the one place in the world she could let her guard down. She opened the door and stepped inside. "Tadaima," she called out, the traditional Japanese, "I'm home." The only reply was the crushing silence. A sliver of unease must have pierced her exhaustion. The house was dark. The air felt wrong. Where was her mother? Usually the television would be on, or she would hear sounds from the kitchen. "Oka-san," she called out, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. "Mom!" Lin Jun exploded from the shadows. Chika's world imploded in an instant of pure terror. The man from her worst nightmares was real, and he was in her living room. Before she could process the sight, before a full scream could even form in her throat, he was on her. The attack was swift, merciless, and brutally efficient. He had been waiting all day for this moment. He plunged the knife into her again and again, a frenzied, desperate act to silence this new witness. Chika, bright, beloved Chika, collapsed onto the floor of the home she had loved, her life extinguished just steps from the front door. 2 down. The house was now a tomb, consecrated with the blood of a mother and daughter. Lin Jun, now a double murderer, was operating on pure, cold adrenaline. He had to finish this. He hid Chika's body near her mother's, another tragic secret swallowed by the house. He stole Chika's purse, rifling through it for cash. He was a monster, wearing a human face, his actions driven by a grotesque fusion of greed and self-preservation. He checked the time. The sun would be next. He settled back into the shadows and waited once more. The silence in the house was deeper now, heavier, weighted with the souls of the 2 women who lay still in the darkness. An hour later, close to 8 p.m., the front door opened again. Takayuki Yamada stepped inside. Like his sister, he called out, "Tadaima!" and was met with the same profound, unnatural silence. But for Takayuki, the alarm bells rang instantly and loudly. The house was pitch black. A strange, coppery smell, thick and sickening, hung in the air. This wasn't just an empty house. This was a violated one. Every nerve in his body screamed danger. He took a cautious step forward, calling out his mother's and sister's names. His voice echoed in the stillness. Suddenly, a figure lunged at him from the side. Takayuki reacted on pure instinct. He threw up his arms to defend himself, a sharp, searing pain exploding in his hand as a blade sliced through his flesh. Unlike his mother and sister, Takayuki was not caught completely by surprise. The wrongness of the scene had prepared his body for flight or fight, and Takayuki chose to fight. He grappled with his attacker, a desperate, clumsy struggle in the dark. He was younger, stronger than his opponent had anticipated. He felt another slash, this time on his head. Pain, hot and blinding, threatened to overwhelm him, but his will to live was a fire that would not be extinguished. He shoved the man with all his might, creating a precious inch of separation. In that split second, he made his choice. He wasn't going to win this fight. He had to escape. He turned and bolted out the front door he had just entered, a scream tearing from his throat. "Help! A burglar! Help me!" He didn't look back. He just ran. He ran with the terror of a man who had just looked into the face of absolute evil. He ran with the horrifying, subconscious knowledge that he was leaving his mother and sister behind in that house of horrors. He pounded on a neighbor's door, blood streaming from his wounds, his words a desperate, incoherent torrent of terror. Inside the house, Lin Jun was stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. The son had escaped. The alarm had been raised. The clock on his stolen time had just run out. Panic, the emotion that had started this nightmare, returned with a vengeance. He scrambled through the house, grabbing whatever he could, the cash he'd taken from Chika's purse, a few other valuables. It wasn't much, a pittance, bought with 2 lives. He fled out the back, melting back into the same darkness from which he had emerged, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. When the police arrived, they found a house that had been transformed into a charnel house. The quiet, loving home of the Yamada family was now a gruesome, blood-spattered crime scene. They found the bodies of Misako and Chika, their lives brutally cut short. The evidence of the killer's long, ghoulish stay was everywhere. The half-eaten food, the used glass, the faint fingerprints on surfaces he had touched in his monstrous vigil. The investigation was swift and intense. Takayuki's harrowing account gave them a description of the attacker. The partial fingerprints left at the scene were a crucial lead. The entire nation was gripped by the horror of the Kaney murders. It was a story that struck at the very heart of Japan's sense of safety. If a family could be so brutally slaughtered in their own home in a town like Kaney, where was anyone safe? The net began to close. Investigators quickly identified their prime suspect, Lin Jun, the Chinese trainee who had recently disappeared from his job and dormitory. The evidence mounted, painting a clear picture of his guilt. But he was gone. He had used the head start he had bought with blood to flee the country, escaping to his native China. For 3 long years, justice remained elusive. For Takayuki, they must have been years of unimaginable grief and guilt. He was the survivor, the one who got away. He carried the physical scars of the attack, but they were nothing compared to the psychological wounds, the haunting memory of the silence that had greeted him in his home. Then, in August 2012, the story took its final turn. Acting on a request from Japanese authorities, Chinese police located and arrested Lin Jun in Anhui province. The shadow that had fallen over the Yamada house had finally been caught. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, including a confession, Lin Jun was tried in China. The Chinese judicial system, unlike Japan's, does not extradite its own nationals for crimes committed abroad. He was tried for robbery and murder under Chinese law. The court heard the chilling details of his crimes, the desperation, the cold-blooded waiting, the brutal murders of a mother and daughter, all for a handful of cash. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. In the end, Lin Jun paid for his crimes with his own life. But justice, however final, can never be a true restoration. It cannot bring back Misako Yamada's gentle smile. It cannot resurrect Chika Yamada's bright future. It cannot erase the horror from Takayuki's memory or fill the profound, silent void in the house on that quiet street in Kaney. The house still stands, a silent monument to the tragedy it witnessed. The story of the Kaney murders serves as a chilling reminder that the membrane separating a normal life from unspeakable horror is terrifyingly thin, and that sometimes the most monstrous acts are not born of grand evil, but of the quiet, creeping desperation of an ordinary man. The silence that Takayuki Yamada came home to that night has never truly left. It echoes still, a permanent and tragic testament to the night that evil came to visit and decided to stay for dinner. The silence of the clay kiln. Town Part 1. The Unanswered Call. It begins, as so many modern tragedies do, with a silence that grows too loud. For Kenji Tanaka, the silence started as a mild annoyance, a text message sent on Monday, left on read, a phone call on Tuesday that rang and rang until it was swallowed by the polite, digital voice of the answering machine. He left a message. "Emmy? It's me. Just checking in. Call me back when you get a chance." Kenji was a man accustomed to structure. He was 69 years old, a retired salaryman who had spent 45 years of his life taking the same train into Nagoya, his existence a metronome of predictable beats. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Even in retirement, he craved this rhythm. He lived alone now, in a small, clean apartment in the city, a 10-minute walk from the train station. He and Emmy had separated 5 years prior, not with the fire of a bitter divorce, but with the quiet, weary sigh of two people who had simply run out of things to say to each other. Their marriage had become a hollowed-out gourd, still holding its shape, but empty inside. He provided. That was his role. Even after moving out, he sent money every month, a direct deposit into Emmy's account. It was enough. More than enough for her and their 2 children, Haru and Yuki, who still lived in the family home in Tokoname. By Wednesday, the annoyance had curdled into a knot of unease in his stomach. Emmy was meticulous. She always returned his calls, if only to confirm the money had arrived or to share some brief, sterile update about the children. She would never just ignore him. He called again. The phone rang, a shrill, insistent plea into an empty space. No voicemail this time. The mailbox was full. Full. A cold spike of adrenaline, sharp and unwelcome, lanced through him. A full voicemail box meant the phone had been ringing unanswered for days. Weeks, perhaps. How long does it take? He thought of his children. Haru, his son, was 43, a bright boy once, top of his class, the family's pride. But something had snapped in him after he'd failed his university entrance exams a second time. He retreated. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a permanent siege. Haru had become a hikikomori, a recluse, a ghost haunting the second floor of their home. For 20 years, his world had been the four walls of his bedroom. Kenji hadn't seen his son's face in over a decade. He only knew he was still there from Emi's hushed reports. He ate today, she'd say, and it was meant to be a victory. And Yuki, his daughter, 42, quieter than Haru, more compliant. She had worked part-time at a convenience store until her early 30s, but then she, too, had retreated into the house. She wasn't a recluse like her brother. She was more of a satellite, caught in the gravitational pull of her mother's anxious orbit and her brother's immense, silent despair. She helped Emi with the house, a shadow at her mother's side. His family, a triptych of quiet desperation, curated by a woman he no longer understood. And he, the patriarch, had abdicated his throne, content to rule from exile with monthly wire transfers. On Thursday, the silence was screaming at him. He stood in his sterile apartment, the city's hum a distant drone, and felt a dread so profound it was almost physical. It was the oppressive humidity of late June in Aichi Prefecture, a weight that settled on the soul. He knew he had to go. The drive from Nagoya to Tokoname took less than an hour, but it felt like a journey across a desolate, alien landscape. Tokoname, the ancient pottery town, famous for its sloping clay pipeline paths and iconic climbing kilns. He and Emi had bought the house there 30 years ago, believing the sea breeze and the town's artistic, rustic charm would be a good place to raise a family. Now, the narrow, winding streets felt claustrophobic, the traditional wooden houses with their heavy tiled roofs like silent, judging elders. He pulled up to the house. It was a handsome, two-story home set back a little from the road. But something was wrong. The garden, Emi's pride, was a riot of weeds, strangling the last of the rose bushes. A stack of newspapers, yellowed and swollen with rain, lay piled by the front door, bound by twine that was beginning to fray. The mailbox was crammed full, a metal tongue gagged with unread letters and promotional flyers. He got out of the car. The air was thick, syrupy, and underneath the scent of salt from the nearby Ise Bay and the faint, earthy smell of the town's kilns, there was another smell. Faint at first, he almost dismissed it as a dead animal trapped under the house. A stray cat, maybe. But as he walked up the stone path, the smell intensified. It was sweet, cloying, and foul all at once. A scent of rot and decay so deeply, primordially wrong, that it bypassed his brain and went straight to his gut. His stomach heaved. He had a key. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking. The lock was stiff from disuse. He put his shoulder into the door, and it groaned open, with the sound of a tomb being unsealed. The smell hit him like a physical blow. It was a wall of corruption, a living, breathing entity that filled the house. It was the smell of forgotten fruit, of spoiled meat, of human waste, and something else. Something infinitely worse. He gagged, pulling the collar of his shirt over his nose, and then he saw the flies. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. They swarmed in the dim light of the Genkin, the entryway, their buzzing a manic, deafening chorus. They were large, black, and iridescent, bloated from their feast. "Emi?" he called out, his voice a pathetic, strangled croak. "Yuki, Haru." The only answer was the thrumming of a million tiny wings. He took a hesitant step inside, his shoes crunching on the brittle bodies of dead insects. The air was so thick he could taste it. He forced himself forward, moving through the gloom of the first floor. The curtains were all drawn, casting the living room in a perpetual twilight. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine gray snow covering a life that had ended long ago. He saw a figure slumped on the sofa. For a moment, his mind refused to process it. It was just a shape, a bundle of clothes, but the shape was wrong, the angle was wrong, and the cloud of flies was thickest here. He drew closer, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her body was grotesquely bloated and discolored, the skin a mottled tapestry of black and green. Her features were unrecognizable, melted away by the relentless work of decomposition. But he knew. He knew from the simple floral print dress she was wearing, one he remembered her buying for a wedding they attended 15 years ago. Emmy, he whispered, the name dissolving into a sob. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. He stumbled back, his hand finding the wall for support. He had to get out. He had to call the police. But something compelled him to look further, a dreadful morbid need to know the full extent of the horror. He forced his legs to move, to carry him up the stairs. Each step was a monumental effort. The air grew hotter, thicker, the smell more concentrated. The buzzing of the flies was louder up here, an infernal symphony reaching its crescendo. The door to Yuki's room was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. She was on her futon, lying on her side as if asleep. But she was like her mother, a grotesque parody of life, swollen and silent. The small, neat room, with its collection of plush toys on a shelf, had become a charnel house. He backed out, a guttural sound of pure animal terror escaping his lips. One room left, Haru's room. The door was closed. For 20 years, that door had been a barrier between his son and the world, between his son and him. He didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee this house of death and never look back. But he was a father, even a failed one. He had to know. He reached for the doorknob, his hands slick with sweat. He turned it. The door swung inward. The swarm of flies that burst out of the room was so thick, it was like a black wave, forcing him to shield his face. The stench was apocalyptic. And in the center of the room, on a bed that had become his entire world, lay the remains of his son. The final silence. Kenji Tanaka finally broke. He stumbled back down the stairs, falling, crawling his way out of the front door and into the humid June air. He collapsed onto the weed-choked lawn, gasping, retching, his mind shattered into a million pieces. The silence from the house was absolute now. The story was over. But for Kenji, the questions, the terrible, unanswerable questions, had just begun. How? And dear God, why? Part 2. The slow closing of the door. To understand how a family dies of hunger in a modern, affluent nation, in a house full of modern conveniences, you have to understand the slow, insidious creep of isolation. It doesn't happen overnight. It's 1,000 tiny concessions, a series of doors closing one by one, so quietly you barely notice, until you find yourself walled into a tomb of your own making. The first door to close was Haru's. 20 years ago, Haru Tanaka was the promise of the family. He was smart, handsome in a quiet way, and obedient. He was everything a Japanese son was supposed to be. He studied relentlessly for the notoriously difficult university entrance exams, fueled by black coffee and his mother's fierce, unwavering belief in him. His success would be her success. His life would validate hers. He failed, not spectacularly, but he missed the cut for the top-tier university he, and by extension his parents, had set his sights on. It was a blow, but not a fatal one. Next year, Kenji had said, clapping him on the shoulder with a heartiness he didn't feel. You'll study harder. You'll make it next time. Emmy, however, reacted differently. She saw the failure not as a setback, but as a wound inflicted upon her son by a cruel, judgmental world. The pressure was too much, she'd whispered to Kenji late at night. They expect too much of these boys. Haru tried again the following year. He studied in a cram school, his world shrinking to textbooks and practice tests. The pressure mounted, a physical weight on his shoulders. The fear of failing again was a constant, metallic taste in his mouth. He started having panic attacks, his heart racing, his breath catching in his throat. He failed again, this time by a wider margin. And that's when the door to his bedroom closed. At first, he just stayed in for a few days, Emi telling a concerned Kenji he needs to rest. He's exhausted, poor thing. The days turned into a week. Emi would leave trays of food outside his door, which would be taken in when no one was looking. The week turned into a month. The family stopped eating together. Haru's presence became an absence, a gravitational void on the second floor. Kenji would try to talk to him, knocking on the door. "Haru, son, let's talk." The only reply was silence. "Leave him be," Emi would plead, her eyes wide with a kind of fearful devotion. "You'll only make it worse. He's fragile right now. He needs to heal." This was the beginning of the great schism in the family. Kenji, a man of action and pragmatism, saw his son's retreat as a weakness to be confronted. "This is ridiculous, Emi. He's a grown man. He can't just hide in his room for the rest of his life." Emi saw it as a sacred duty to protect her wounded child. "You don't understand him. The world outside is what hurt him. This house is the only place he's safe." Their arguments became bitter, cyclical. Kenji felt his authority in his own home eroding. He was the provider, the patriarch, but he had no say in the strange, cloistered world Emi was building around their son. He was an outsider, looking in. The second door to close was Yuki's. She was the forgotten child, the quiet one who never caused any trouble. She watched her brother disappear and her parents' marriage crumble around the altar of his seclusion. She worked her job at the 7-Eleven, her life a simple, unassuming routine. But the shame was a constant companion. The pitying looks from neighbors, the hushed questions. "How is your brother?" When she was 32, she was laid off. The store was downsizing. For anyone else, it would be an inconvenience. For Yuki, it was a catastrophe. The job had been her only tether to the world outside her family's dysfunction. Without it, she was adrift. She didn't look for another job. The thought of interviews, of explaining the gap in her resume, of facing the world's judgment was terrifying. It was easier to just stay home. Emi, seeing another of her children wounded by the outside world, welcomed her back into the fold. "It's for the best, for now," she'd said. "You can help me around the house. You can help me look after Haru." Yuki became her mother's lieutenant. She cooked, she cleaned, she helped prepare the tray for the ghost upstairs. Her world shrank to the size of the house and garden. She and Emi developed their own silent language, their own routines. The house became their fortress, and the two of them its loyal sentinels, guarding the mysterious invalid king in his tower. The third door was the one Kenji closed himself. After another explosive argument with Emi about getting professional help for Haru, a suggestion she met with horror as if he'd proposed handing their son over to torturers, he packed a bag. "I can't do this anymore, Emi," he'd said, his voice raw with years of frustration. "I can't live in this shrine to failure. This isn't a family, it's a prison." "Then go," she had replied, her face a mask of cold resolve. "Go back to your precious world that has no room for people like us. We don't need it. We don't need you." The words were a blade. He left. He found the apartment in Nagoya, and the silence he had craved became his reality. The monthly payments were his penance, his last remaining connection. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself they were fine. He told himself Emi was a capable woman. He told himself these lies until he almost believed them. The final door was the front door of the house in Tokoname. After Kenji left, Emi's worldview, already warped, began to fully fracture. The outside world was no longer just a source of pain. It was a source of contamination. It was full of judgment, disease, and financial demands. Her mission was no longer just to protect her children, but to purify their existence, to create a space completely sealed off from its influence. It started with small things. She stopped answering the phone to anyone but Kenji. She let the newspapers pile up. She stopped tending the garden. Why beautify a house for a world you despise? The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Sato from next door saw Emi at the grocery store one day. Emi looked thin, her eyes darting around nervously. Mrs. Sato smiled and said, "Good afternoon, Tanaka-san." "It's been a while." Emi flinched as if struck. She mumbled something and hurried away, leaving a half-full basket in the aisle. It was the last time anyone in the neighborhood saw her. After that, the groceries started coming via delivery. Then, even the delivery orders became less frequent. The curtains, once opened every morning, remained drawn. The house on the hill, once a symbol of middle-class success, became a dark, silent monolith, a place of whispers and speculation. Inside that monolith, the 3 remaining members of the Tanaka family were embarking on their final, terrible journey. Emmy, their loving mother, their fierce protector, was about to lead them into the dark. Part 3. The Hunger. The decision, when it came, felt not like a surrender, but like a revelation. It was a cold evening in January, nearly a year before Kenji would break down the door. The last of his monthly payments had come and gone. The savings account, once respectable, was now a wasteland. Emmy sat at the kitchen table, the bank book open in front of her. The numbers stared back, stark and unforgiving. There was enough for another month of food, maybe 6 weeks if they were careful. And then, nothing. The thought of asking Kenji for more was impossible. It would be an admission of defeat, a confirmation of everything he'd accused her of. The thought of sending Yuki out to find a job, or, God forbid, forcing Haru to face the world, was equally unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of her sacred mission. She looked around the silent house. Upstairs, her son was a phantom presence. In the living room, her daughter was listlessly watching a television show, the volume turned low. They were her charges, her precious, broken children. The world had failed them. She would not. And then, the idea bloomed in her mind, a dark and perfect flower. It was an idea born of pride, fear, and a love so twisted, it had become a form of madness. They didn't need the world's money. They didn't need its food. They could transcend. She went into the living room and turned off the television. Yuki looked up, startled. "Mother." "We need to talk," Emmy said, her voice imbued with a strange new authority. She went to the bottom of the stairs. "Haru, can you hear me? I need you to listen." There was no answer, but she knew he was there. He was always there, listening. "The money is gone," she announced to the silent house. "The world has cut us off. It has decided we are not worthy of its sustenance." Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady, prophetic. "But we will not be beaten. We will not beg. We will show them that we do not need them." She laid out her plan. It was not a plan of starvation. In her mind, it was a plan of purification, a spiritual fast. "We will cleanse ourselves," she explained, her eyes burning with a feverish light. "We will empty ourselves of the world's toxins, its food, its worries, its filth. We will become pure. We will live on water, and in this purity, we will find a new kind of strength, a new kind of freedom." To a rational mind, it was the rambling of a lunatic. But in the hermetically sealed reality of the Tanaka house, logic had long been a casualty. Yuki, accustomed to obeying her mother without question, simply nodded. To her, this was just another of her mother's strange new rules, no different than keeping the curtains drawn or speaking in whispers. And Haru, listening from the darkness of his room, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: relief. The final, terrifying demand of the world, the demand to eat, to participate, to exist, was being lifted. His mother was giving him permission to finally, truly disappear. The first few days were the hardest. The hunger was a physical beast, a gnawing, cramping monster in their bellies. Emmy was a zealot, rationing out glasses of tap water, speaking constantly of their spiritual journey. "Feel the poison leaving your body," she would urge them, her own stomach rumbling. "This is not pain. This is renewal." They emptied the pantry and the refrigerator, throwing out the last of the food. It was a ritualistic act, a final severing of ties. The smell of the garbage bin outside, full of perfectly good food, was a form of temptation they had to overcome. After a week, the acute hunger pangs subsided, replaced by a dull, constant ache and a profound, bone-deep weariness. Time began to lose its shape. Without the rhythm of meals, days blurred into a single gray twilight, dictated only by the light filtering through the edges of the thick curtains. Their world became small, and then smaller still. The first floor was Yuki and Emi's domain. The second floor was Haru's. They rarely spoke. What was there to say? Their shared experience was beyond words. Horror began to seep into the mundane. The house, once a fortress, became a source of terror. A floorboard creaking upstairs was not just the house settling, it was a sign, a message. The drip of a faucet was a voice whispering. In their malnourished, light-deprived state, their minds began to play tricks on them. Emi became convinced they were being watched. "They're out there," she'd whisper to Yuki, pointing a trembling finger at the curtained window. "The neighbors, they're listening. They're jealous of our purity." Yuki would peer through a crack in the curtains. She'd see Mrs. Sato watering her plants and see not a kindly old woman, but a spy, a hostile agent from the world they had forsaken. Upstairs, Haru's reality decayed even faster. Alone in his room, the darkness was his only companion. The patterns on the ceiling began to swirl and form faces. He'd hear Kenji's voice, berating him, calling him a failure. He'd hear the laughter of his old schoolmates. The hunger made him weak, but his imagination, fed by years of isolation and regret, became monstrously strong. He was trapped, not just in a room, but in a nightmare of his own making. Their bodies began to betray them. They grew skeletal, their skin turning a pale, waxy yellow. Their hair began to fall out in clumps. Walking from the kitchen to the living room became an exhausting pilgrimage. Emi, once a stout, energetic woman, was now a fragile wraith, her eyes sunken into her skull, burning with a light that was either holy or insane. She was the first to start failing. One afternoon, her legs simply gave out as she was climbing the stairs to leave a glass of water for Haru. She collapsed, the glass shattering. She lay there for hours, unable to get up, listening to the water drip, drip, drip into the floorboards. Yuki found her, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, dragged her to the sofa in the living room. That sofa became Emi's deathbed. In her final days, Emi was delirious. She babbled about her garden, about recipes she wanted to try. She spoke to her own long-dead mother, but mostly, she spoke of her children. "My beautiful children," she'd rasp, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "So pure, so safe now. I kept you safe." Yuki sat by her side, holding her mother's cold, bird-like hand. The hunger was a constant fog in her own brain, but one thought remained clear. She had to care for her mother. It was her final purpose. She would fetch her water, wipe her brow. She listened to her mother's ravings and nodded as if it all made perfect sense. One morning, Yuki woke up on the floor beside the sofa. The house was colder than usual. The rhythmic, rasping sound of her mother's breathing had stopped. There was only silence. Emi was gone. Her eyes were open, still staring at the ceiling, but the fanatical light in them was extinguished. Yuki felt nothing. No grief, no panic. The part of her brain that processed such emotions had long since starved to death. She looked at her mother's body, now just an object, a piece of furniture in the room. She was tired, so incredibly tired. She stumbled to the stairs. "Haru," she called out, her voice a dry whisper. "Mother is gone." There was no reply. She didn't have the strength to climb the stairs. She crawled to her own futon in the small room off the living room. She lay down. The silence of the house was complete now, save for a new sound. A low, persistent buzzing that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The flies had found their way in. Upstairs, Haru heard his sister's call, but it sounded like it came from a great distance. "Mother is gone." The words registered, but didn't connect. His own body was shutting down. He hadn't left his bed in weeks. The world was a dream. The buzzing was getting louder. He closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's face, not the skeletal mask it had become, but how it looked years ago, smiling at him after he'd won a school prize. It was a good memory. He held on to it as the darkness finally, mercifully, took him. The house was still. 3 bodies in 3 separate rooms began the slow, inexorable process of returning to the earth. The purification Emi had so desperately sought had been achieved. It was not a spiritual transcendence. It was the simple, brutal chemistry of decay. The buzzing grew louder. The silence was over. The chorus had begun. Part 4. The Reckoning. The aftermath was a blur of sterile official horror. Kenji sat on a plastic chair in a brightly lit room at the Tokoname police station, a cup of lukewarm tea untouched in front of him. He had given his statement, a disjointed, rambling account of the unanswered calls and the terrible discovery. The words felt like ashes in his mouth. A detective, a young man with a tired, compassionate face, sat opposite him. "Tanaka-san," he said, his voice gentle. "The initial report from the coroner is in. We can't be certain until the full autopsy, of course, but the preliminary findings are consistent." Kenji looked at him, his eyes hollow. Consistent with what? The detective hesitated, choosing his words carefully. With severe, prolonged malnutrition. Starvation. The word hung in the air-conditioned room, obscene and impossible. Starvation. Not in a war-torn country, not in a famine, in a comfortable two-story house in one of the world's wealthiest nations, a house he owned, a family he was supposed to be providing for. "But I sent money," Kenji stammered, the defense sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "Every month, without fail. The bank records will show it. There was money." The detective nodded slowly. "We are looking into the financial records, yes. It appears the last withdrawal from your wife's account was made almost a year ago. The account has a substantial balance." The blood drained from Kenji's face. The money had been there. All this time, the money to live, to eat, to survive, was sitting in a bank just a few miles away, but they hadn't touched it. They had chosen to die instead. The detective's words faded into a dull roar in Kenji's ears. He was seeing the house again. Not the clean, happy home he remembered from years ago, but the stinking, fly-infested tomb he had opened. He saw Emi's fierce, protective eyes, and he finally understood. It wasn't about the money. It was about her. It was her pride, her madness. She couldn't admit she needed him. She couldn't admit her way had failed. So she had turned her failure into a righteous crusade, a holy war against the world, and she had marched her own children into oblivion with her. They hadn't died of starvation. They had died of a mother's love, a love that had become so toxic and all-consuming, it had poisoned them from the inside out. And his children, his quiet, compliant daughter, and his brilliant, broken son. They had followed her. They had trusted her. They had let her lead them to their deaths, because the alternative, facing the world, had become more terrifying than starving in the dark. "Why didn't they call me?" Kenji whispered, the question directed at no one. Why didn't they just open the door? The detective had no answer. There was no answer. In the weeks that followed, the story became a local sensation, then a national one. The Tokoname family annihilation. Tragedy of the Hikikomori. The house was sealed, a yellow police tape stretched across the gate like a scar. Forensics teams in white hazmat suits moved in and out, their presence an alien intrusion into the quiet neighborhood. Kenji had to arrange the cremations. 3 of them. There was no funeral. Who would come? He was the only one left. He collected 3 small, white wooden boxes of ash and bone. His wife, his son, his daughter, an entire family reduced to a weight he could carry in his arms. He returned to his apartment in Nagoya. The clean, quiet space that had once been his refuge now felt like a mausoleum. Every silence accused him. Every meal he ate was an act of betrayal. He would sit and stare at the wall, replaying the last 20 years in his mind. The arguments with Emi, the closed door of his son's room. The day he walked out, he saw every mistake, every wrong turn, every word left unsaid. He had thought he was doing the right thing by giving them space, by not forcing a confrontation. He had thought his money was a substitute for his presence. He had been a coward. He had abdicated his duties as a husband and a father, and the bill for his abdication had finally come due. It was a price paid in 3 human lives. One evening, months later, he drove back to Tokoname. He didn't know why. He parked down the street from the house and just looked at it. The police tape was gone, but the house remained sealed, a notice from the city pasted on the door. It was dark, silent, an empty socket in the face of the neighborhood. The garden was completely dead now, a brown, tangled mess. He thought he could still smell it. The sweet, sickly scent of death. Maybe it was just his memory. Or maybe a house like that, a house where such a profound and quiet horror had unfolded, holds on to its ghosts forever. He was a ghost now, too. A man haunted not by the spirits of his dead family, but by the living, breathing reality of their final, agonizing months. He would spend the rest of his life standing on the outside of that sealed door, listening to the screaming silence within, asking the same question over and over, a mantra of eternal damnation. Why? But the house on the hill in the old clay kiln town offered no answers. It just stood there, empty and dark, a monument to a silence that had consumed everything. The Twilight Killer of Wakamatsu Street. Author's note. This story is a dramatized retelling of a true event. The core facts, the date, location, and nature of the crime are accurate. Names, specific personal details, and internal monologues have been fictionalized to build a narrative and to honor the privacy of those involved. It is a story not just of a crime, but of a life taken and a community broken. Part 1. The Golden Hour. May 2nd, 2008. In Toyota, a city in the Aichi Prefecture of Japan, the name itself is a promise of order, of industry, of things that work. It's the home of the automotive giant, a place built on precision, where every screw has its place, and every day follows a predictable, comforting rhythm. The city hums with a quiet efficiency, its arteries of asphalt and rail carrying its people from tidy homes to disciplined workplaces and back again. It is a city that believes in safety, in the unspoken contract that if you follow the rules, you will be protected. For 16-year-old Natsumi Hagi, this rhythm was the soundtrack of her life. She was a product of this city's promise, diligent, bright, with a future that seemed as well engineered as the cars rolling off the assembly lines. Natsumi was in her second year of high school, a time in a Japanese student's life of intense pressure and fleeting joys. She navigated it with a grace that belied her age. Her hair was a sheet of glossy black ink, usually tied back in a neat ponytail that bounced when she laughed. Her friends would say her most defining feature was her eyes. They were kind, but held a spark of quiet ambition. She dreamed of being a graphic designer, of creating worlds with color and line, a stark contrast to the monochrome world of her school uniform and the gray concrete of the city. That Friday, May 2nd, was different. It was the heart of Golden Week, a string of national holidays that gave most of Japan a cherished break. The air itself felt lighter, freer. The usual frenetic pace of the city had softened to a leisurely stroll. For Natsumi, however, it was a day of duty. Her school, like many, held classes to make up for lost time, a small sacrifice for the long weekend ahead. The day passed as any other. The drone of the teacher's voice, the scratching of pencils on paper, the whispered jokes with her best friend, Ayaka, in the seat beside her. They made plans. The rest of Golden Week stretched before them, a sun-drenched canvas waiting to be painted. There was a movie they wanted to see, a new cafe with elaborate parfaits they were dying to try. "You'll text me the second you get home?" Ayaka asked, as they packed their bags at the end of the day. The classroom was emptying out, the afternoon sun slanting through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "Promise," Natsumi said, zipping up her heavy school bag. It was a standard-issue dark blue canvas bag, but hers was personalized with a small, beaded charm of a cat she'd made herself. It was filled with textbooks, notebooks dense with her neat handwriting, her pencil case, a half-eaten bag of rice crackers, and her wallet, which held a few thousand yen, her allowance and money for the train. It also held her student ID, with a slightly goofy, smiling picture of herself. They walked together to the train station, their chatter a familiar comfort. They spoke of everything and nothing. The impossible trigonometry homework, a new pop song, the cute boy in the kendo club. At the station, they stood on the platform, the familiar automated voice announcing the train's arrival. "See you tomorrow then," Ayaka said, giving her a quick wave as her train hissed to a stop. "Tomorrow," Natsumi smiled. "Don't eat all the parfaits without me." Natsumi's own train arrived a few minutes later. She found a seat by the window and watched the city blur past. The sun was beginning its slow descent, dipping below the horizon in a spectacular blaze of orange and pink. It was the golden hour, that magical, fleeting time when the world seems soft-edged and beautiful. It was Natsumi Hagi's favorite time of day. She pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw the shifting colors of the sky, trying to capture the transient beauty on paper. She was so absorbed in her art, in the world she was creating, that she barely noticed the other passengers disembarking, leaving the carriage nearly empty. Her stop was Kozukai Station. From there, it was a 15-minute walk home. It was a walk she had made thousands of times, a path etched into her muscle memory. She slung her heavy bag over her shoulder and stepped off the train into the cooling evening air. The time was 6:40 p.m. The sun had bled out, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. Streetlights began to flicker on, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. The first part of her walk was along a main road, still humming with the light traffic of a holiday evening. Cars whooshed past, their headlights cutting bright swathes through the gloom. But then, she had to turn onto Wakamatsu Street. Wakamatsu Street was different. It was a narrow residential road, a shortcut that shaved a few minutes off her journey. It was flanked by two-story homes with neatly trimmed hedges and privacy walls. During the day, it was a quiet, pleasant street. But at night, it transformed. The houses, set back from the road, seemed to retreat into themselves. The streetlights were fewer and farther between here, creating deep pools of impenetrable darkness between their cones of pale yellow light. On one side of the street ran a small, concrete-lined irrigation canal, its water black and still. On the other, a high wall, belonging to a local factory, ran for 100 meters, creating a blind, featureless corridor. As Natsumi turned onto the street, a sudden quiet fell. The hum of the main road faded behind her, replaced by the soft scuff of her own shoes on the asphalt and the distant barking of a dog. She clutched the strap of her bag a little tighter. It was a familiar, reflexive action. Every girl learns this feeling, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the prickling on the back of the neck that signals you are no longer just walking, you are exposed. She quickened her pace. Her home was only 5 minutes away now. She could already picture it, the warm glow of the Genkin light her mother always left on, the smell of dinner, the sound of the television, comfort, safety, a sound behind her, a footstep. She slowed, listening. Silence. Only the thumping of her own heart, suddenly loud in her ears. It's nothing, she told herself. Just your imagination. The dog barked again, closer this time. She started walking again, faster now. Her black school loafers made soft, rhythmic taps on the ground. Tap, tap, tap. Then another sound, right behind her own. Tap, 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 tap. Someone was matching her stride. Ice shot through her veins. This wasn't imagination. This was real. Every horror story her mother had ever told her, every news report about attacks on lone women, flashed through her mind. Don't look back, a primal voice screamed inside her head. Don't let them know you know. Just walk faster. Get to the light. Get home. Her house was just around the next bend, so close. The street ahead was dark, but she could see the faint, welcoming glow from her own street, her own home. She fixed her eyes on it, a tiny beacon in the oppressive dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer, faster. They were no longer trying to be stealthy. They were running. Panic seized her. All thought of strategy vanished. Natsumi broke into a dead sprint. Her heavy bag slapped against her back, throwing her off balance. The beaded cat charm clinked frantically. She could hear ragged breathing now, a harsh, guttural sound right behind her ear. It was the sound of a predator. She opened her mouth to scream, but her breath caught in her throat, strangled by terror. A hand grabbed the strap of her school bag, yanking her backward with brutal force. She stumbled, pinwheeling her arms, and fell hard onto the cold, unforgiving asphalt. The air was knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. Before she could even process the fall, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, into the face of a man. He was a stranger, his features twisted into a mask of grim determination she couldn't comprehend. She saw something glint in his hand under the weak light of the distant streetlight. It was a knife. The scream finally tore from her throat, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror that shattered the night's silence. It was a desperate plea for help, for salvation, for the entire world to stop and look at this monstrous thing that was happening on this quiet street in this safe city. The scream was cut short. A fiery, incandescent pain erupted in her abdomen, then another in her chest, and another. A hot, wet sensation spread across her school uniform. The man said nothing. His movements were frantic, vicious, mechanical. It wasn't a fight, it was an extermination. Her vision began to tunnel. The edges of the world turned black. The man's contorted face blurred and faded. The last thing she saw was him ripping the bag from her shoulder. The last thing she heard was the sound of his footsteps running away, fading back into the darkness from which he came. Then there was only the cold of the asphalt, the smell of her own blood, and the profound, crushing silence of Wakamatsu Street. The light from her home, just around the corner, continued to glow, a promise unkept. Part 2. The Broken Promise. The call came into the Toyota police precinct at 7:15 p.m. The voice on the line was frantic, bordering on hysterical. A man, out walking his dog, had found her. He'd seen a dark shape on the road, thought it was a discarded pile of clothes, and had his dog pull him closer. The reality of what he saw would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Detective Hiroshi Ishikawa was 48 years old. He had a face etched with the lines of too many long nights and too many grim discoveries. He was a man who, like the city he served, believed in order. His job was to restore that order when it was violently disrupted. When he heard the dispatcher's report, high school girl, multiple stab wounds, Wakamatsu Street, a familiar leaden weight settled in his stomach. He knew, even before he arrived, that this was not a restoration job. This was a salvage operation for a ghost. Wakamatsu Street was no longer a quiet residential lane. It was a scene of controlled chaos, bathed in the flashing, disorienting strobes of red and blue police lights. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, a flimsy barrier against an unspeakable horror. Ishikawa ducked under it, his gaze sweeping the scene. Uniformed officers were already at work, securing the perimeter, talking to the few neighbors who had dared to venture from their homes, their faces pale and drawn in the harsh police lights. And there, in the center of it all, was the victim, Natsumi Hagi. She lay on her back, her limbs askew at an unnatural angle. The dark blue of her school blazer was stained a horrifying, glistening black. Her face, even in death, was young, her features peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep on the asphalt. But the scene around her told a different story. The sheer amount of blood, the violence of her final moments, was a silent testament to the brutality of the attack. A single white earbud from a pair of headphones lay a few feet from her head, its cord tangled. Ishikawa knelt, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a meticulous man, a believer in details. The details were all that was left of a person's final moments. They were the only voice the dead had. "No bag," he said, his voice low and gravelly. His younger partner, a detective named Kenji Tanaka, made a note. "No wallet, no phone." "Robbery?" Tanaka offered. It was the simplest explanation. "Maybe," Ishikawa grunted, his eyes scanning the ground. "Or it's meant to look like one." He saw the scuff marks on the asphalt, the place where she had fallen. He saw the faint, bloody print of a shoe, not hers, leading away from the body. He saw the small, beaded cat charm, half crushed, lying near a dark stain on the road. He pointed. "Bag that, carefully." The forensics team moved in, their white suits making them look like astronauts exploring a hostile, alien world. They photographed everything, measured everything, collected everything. Every fiber, every drop of blood, every scrap of evidence that might give a name to the shadow that had done this. The hardest part of Ishikawa's job was not the crime scenes, it was the notification. An hour later, he and Tanaka stood on the doorstep of the Hagi residence. It was less than 200 meters from where Natsumi's body lay. The house was bright, warm, and filled with the aroma of a dinner that was getting cold. Mr. Hagi answered the door. He was a man in his late 40s, his face etched with a confusion that was rapidly souring into fear. "Yes, can I help you, officers?" Ishikawa removed his hat. It was a gesture of respect, a silent prelude to the worst news a parent could ever hear. "Mr. Hagi, I am Detective Ishikawa. May we come in?" The moment he saw Natsumi's mother, her face anxious, her hands twisting a dish towel, Ishikawa's carefully constructed professional composure almost cracked. "Is it about Natsumi?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She's late. She always calls if she's going to be late." There is no gentle way to deliver such news. There are only the words, blunt and terrible, that fall like stones and shatter a family's world. Ishikawa spoke them as softly as he could. He watched as confusion turned to disbelief to a dawning, soul-shattering horror. Mrs. Hagi let out a sound that was not a word, but a primal cry of agony, and collapsed. Her husband caught her, his own face a mask of stone-cold shock, tears silently tracking down his cheeks. The order of their world had not just been disrupted, it had been annihilated. The promise of the city, the contract of safety, had been broken in the most violent way imaginable. The investigation began with a ferocious intensity. The entire Toyota police force was mobilized. The media descended like vultures, their cameras and microphones turning the family's private grief into a public spectacle. "High school girl brutally murdered in safe neighborhood," the headline screamed. "Twilight killer on the loose." Fear, cold and sharp, sank its teeth into the city of Toyota. Parents drove their children to school. The once bustling streets grew quiet after dusk. Wakamatsu Street became a place of grim pilgrimage, with flowers and offerings piling up at the spot where Natsumi fell. Her smiling school picture was taped to a telephone pole, a ghostly reminder of the life that had been extinguished there. The investigation, however, was hitting a wall of darkness as deep as the one that had swallowed Natsumi's killer. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. One neighbor reported hearing a single, sharp scream around 6:50 p.m., but had dismissed it as teenagers fooling around. Another resident, several streets away, reported seeing a man running around that time, but the description was vague. Average height, dark clothes, possibly of foreign descent, but they couldn't be sure. The shoe print found at the scene was from a common brand of sneaker. The stolen bag contained nothing of significant monetary value, making the savagery of the attack seem utterly senseless. Why stab a girl a dozen times for a used cell phone and a few thousand yen? The sheer, unadulterated violence of it felt personal, full of rage. Ishikawa and his team worked around the clock. They interviewed hundreds of people: Natsumi's classmates, teachers, known delinquents in the area, registered foreign workers. They chased down every lead, no matter how flimsy. Was it a stalker? They combed through Natsumi's life, her diaries, her computer, her text messages. They found nothing but the innocent dreams and dramas of a teenage girl. There was no secret boyfriend, no hidden enemy. Days turned into weeks. The flowers on Wakamatsu Street wilted. The media attention began to wane, moving on to the next tragedy. But for the police, and for the Hagi family, time stood still. The case was growing cold. The killer, a phantom who had materialized out of the twilight, committed an act of monstrous violence and vanished back into the ether. Detective Ishikawa found himself returning to the crime scene late at night, standing on the spot where Natsumi had died. He would stare into the pools of darkness between the streetlights, trying to understand the mind of the man who had lurked there. Was it planned? Was Natsumi the specific target? Or was she just a crime of opportunity? A random, tragic intersection of a young girl walking home and a predator looking for a victim. This last thought was the most terrifying of all. It meant that it could have been anyone. It meant that there was no logic, no reason, just a hole of violent chaos that had opened up in the middle of their orderly world. The killer wasn't just a murderer, he was a ghost, a living embodiment of the broken promise, and he was still out there. Part 3. The Ghost's Mistake. 1 month after the murder, the investigation was on life support. The incident room, once buzzing with activity, was now quiet and grim. The board was covered in photos, maps, and notes, all of it leading nowhere. The term Twilight Killer had stuck, a chilling moniker for an invisible man. For Detective Ishikawa, the the ghost of Natsumi Hagi was a constant companion. He saw her smiling ID photo every time he closed his eyes. He felt the weight of his failure to her parents with every breath. The pressure from the public and his superiors was immense, but it was nothing compared to the pressure he put on himself. Justice for Ishikawa was not an abstract concept. It was a debt owed to the dead, and this debt was going unpaid. Then they caught a break. It wasn't a dramatic confession or a smoking gun. It was something small, something modern, something the killer couldn't have anticipated. Natsumi's stolen bag and its contents had never been recovered. The assumption was that the killer had thrown it into a river or buried it, but the police had flagged her cell phone and the few credit and debit cards in her wallet. They had been silent for weeks. On a sweltering afternoon in early June, a ping came through. One of the cards, a low-limit prepaid card Natsumi used for online purchases, had been used. It was an automated transaction at a convenience store, not in Toyota, but in the neighboring city of Nagoya. The purchase was small, just a few hundred yen for a drink and a snack. It was a mistake, a tiny, stupid mistake, born of arrogance or desperation. The ghost had left a footprint in the digital world. Ishikawa felt a jolt of adrenaline he hadn't felt in weeks. "Get the security footage, now," he barked into the phone. An hour later, they were watching the grainy, black and white video. A man approached the counter. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low and sunglasses, even though it was late at night. He was nondescript. He could have been anyone. He paid with the card, took his items, and left. The footage was too blurry for a positive ID, but they had something they didn't have before, a recent image, a physical presence. The ghost was becoming flesh and blood. The investigation, moribund for weeks, roared back to life. They cross-referenced the vague witness description from the night of the murder, possibly foreign, with the location of the transaction. Nagoya had a significant population of foreign workers, many from South America, particularly Brazil, who had come to Japan to work in the automotive and manufacturing industries. It was a needle in a haystack, but now they knew which haystack to search. Ishikawa's team began a painstaking process. They pulled records of all foreign nationals living between Toyota and Nagoya who fit the very general profile. They showed the blurry CCTV image to community leaders, to employers, to anyone who might recognize the man in the baseball cap. It was grueling, frustrating work. They interviewed dozens of men. Most had alibis. None of them felt right. The break came from an unexpected source. A police officer in a small precinct in Nagoya remembered a man he'd stopped a few weeks prior for a minor traffic violation. The man was a Brazilian national. He'd been nervous, agitated, far more than the situation warranted. The officer had let him go with a warning, but the man's face had stuck with him. When he saw the composite sketch the police had created based on the blurry CCTV footage and the original witness statement, a flicker of recognition sparked. His name was Moises de Souza Tima, a 32-year-old Brazilian factory worker. He had no serious criminal record in Japan, just a few minor infractions. He lived in a small, cheap apartment in Nagoya. He fit the profile. On a gray, overcast morning, Ishikawa and a team of a dozen officers descended on the apartment building. There was no dramatic raid. They waited for him to leave for work, and as Tima stepped out onto the street, blinking in the morning light, Ishikawa approached him. "Moises Tima?" Ishikawa said, his voice calm but firm. Tima froze. His eyes, wide and panicked, darted from side to side, looking for an escape that wasn't there. In that moment, Ishikawa knew. He saw the same fear he imagined Natsumi must have seen in her final moments. But this was not the fear of a victim. It was the fear of a cornered animal. The search of Tima's apartment was the final nail in the coffin. Tucked away in the back of a closet, stuffed inside an old shoe, they found it. Natsumi Hagi's student ID card. Her smiling, goofy face stared up at them, a silent accusation from beyond the grave. In another box, they found a knife, consistent with the victim's wounds. The interrogation was short. Faced with the undeniable evidence, Moises Tima's bluster and denials crumbled. He sat in the stark, white interrogation room, his head in his hands, and began to talk. The story that spilled out was not one of a calculating monster or a creature of pure evil. It was, in its own way, even more horrifying. It was a story of pathetic desperation, Tima was in debt. He was struggling to send money back to his family in Brazil. He had lost his job and was about to be evicted. On May 2nd, he had taken a train to Toyota, not with a plan to kill, but with a vague, desperate idea to rob someone. Anyone. He saw Natsumi Hagi walking alone down the dark street. She was an easy target, a small girl, burdened by a heavy bag. He hadn't intended to kill her. He just wanted the bag, the money. But when he grabbed her, she screamed. That single, terrified scream had sealed her fate. In his panic, his fear of being caught, his adrenaline-fueled rage at his own pathetic situation, he had pulled the knife he carried for protection. He hadn't just stabbed her once to silence her. He had lost control. The violence had been a release for all his pent-up frustration and failure. It was a storm of pointless, brutal rage unleashed on the first person who crossed his path. He had grabbed her bag and run, leaving her to die on the cold street. He got away with a few thousand yen, a cell phone he was too scared to use, and a life. He had destroyed a family, terrified a city, and extinguished a bright, promising future, all for the price of a few meals. Listening to the confession, Detective Ishikawa felt no satisfaction, no thrill of victory. He just felt a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. The ghost had a name now. The Twilight Killer was just a desperate, pathetic man named Moises Tima. The horror wasn't in the mystery, but in the mundane, senseless reality of it. Natsumi Hagi had not been killed by a monster from a horror film. She was killed by a simple, human failure, by a man who chose to solve his problems with a knife in the dark. Epilogue: The Lingering Shadow. The Trial of Moises. Tima was a formality. He was found guilty of murder and robbery, his confession and the evidence against him overwhelming. He was sentenced to life in prison, the judge condemning the cruel and selfish nature of his crime. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. The system, the machine of order, had worked. A man committed a crime, and he was punished. But on Wakamatsu Street, the shadows remain. The streetlights still cast their pale, yellow cones of light, and the pools of darkness between them still seem deeper, colder. No one uses it as a shortcut anymore. It is a place with a permanent scar, a wound on the city's psyche that will never fully heal. For the Hagi family, there is no closure. There is no verdict or prison sentence that can fill the cavernous, silent hole in their home. Natsumi's room remains as she left it, her sketchbook still open on her desk to a drawing of a sunset. Her dreams of becoming a designer, her plans for the weekend with her friend, her entire future, all of it was stolen in a few seconds of brutal, senseless panic. For Detective Ishikawa, the case became a defining moment of his career. He had caught the killer. He had fulfilled his duty. But he knew that what he had truly done was simply put a name and a face to a void. The ghost of the Twilight Killer had been exorcised, but the ghost of Natsumi Hagi, the bright, kind girl with the beaded cat charm on her bag, would walk with him forever. The story of May 2nd, 2008, is a chilling reminder of the fragility of the promises we live by. The promise of safety, of order, of a quiet walk home. It's a story that proves that horror isn't always found in the supernatural or the monstrous. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the world is the simple, awful truth that a life can be ended for no reason at all by a stranger in the dark, just a few hundred meters from the warmth and safety of home. The twilight came for Natsumi Hagi, and for a city that thought itself safe, the darkness